All right, well, Dr. Ice was going to speak on what is Christian Zionism, and he has a book on a defense of Christian Zionism that you can purchase off of Amazon, probably several other sources. And so there's more detail in sections of his book than what I'm going to be able to go into. My topic is slightly different, and that is Zionism, Christian and Jewish, interdependent, interconnection, and intertwined. That what happened was a number of years ago now, when I first listened to a series of lectures that were done at Camp Shoshone on history of Zionism, that as I was making my notes, I went through that, took extensive detailed notes because I had never heard most of that information. And then several years later, I was reading about Christian Zionism, talking with Tommy, and we're beginning to read things. And I thought, there certainly seems to be some similarities here. So I took a legal pad and I drew a line down the middle, two columns. On the left column, and then I marked it off horizontal lines into decades, from the 1640s through the 1920s. And then I started writing into each section what happened under the Christian Zionism, what happened in Jewish Zionism. And what I saw is an interdependence that was taking place. And most of the time when you hear somebody teach on Zionism, they'll be teaching about Jewish Zionism, and they start with Theodor Herzel. And there's a reason for starting with Herzel, because on March the 10th of 1896, he had a significant encounter, but most people don't talk about this. Herzel is the one who, following the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, if you don't know who Dreyfus was a French officer. He was I think he was in the artillery, but he was basically framed as a Russian spy. And part of the reason they pinned this on him was because of his Jewishness. And a reporter at the trial was Theodor Herzel. And before that, Herzel had a background of being an assimilated Jew. That means he thought of himself, he was born in Budapest, he was living in Vienna, and he lived also in Paris. He thought of himself as an Austrian citizen primarily, and secondarily as a Jew. And at this time, the Jews in Western Europe primarily thought of themselves as a German, or as a British citizen, an Englishman, or as a Frenchman, before they thought of themselves as a Jew, because they had become so assimilated into the culture. But when he went as a reporter to the trial of Dreyfus, he realized that this assimilation was really a sham. That once an issue came up, it was clear that anti-Semitism had reared its ugly head. And so for the previous years, he'd become more and more aware of these problems, and so focused on that. And he realized that the only place where the Jewish people could have a secure life was in their historic homeland of Israel. And he wrote a book called Der Judenstaat, and it fell flat on the Jewish community. The rabbis rejected it, the people rejected it, the powers that be in the Jewish organization said, we're fine, we don't need to go back to Palestine at this point. We're happy. We're Frenchmen, we're Germans, we're Austrian, we're British, we're good. And he was very depressed and very discouraged. And on March the 10th of 1896, there was a knock on his door. And so he goes to answer the door, and standing there was a man whom he described as a prophet who had walked off the pages of the Old Testament. His name was William Heckler. He was the Anglican minister to the British embassies, the chaplain at the British embassy in Vienna. And he had just finished reading Der Judenstaat, and he was so excited he couldn't contain his excitement, so he had to track down where Herzel lived. And he went to him and said, "You need to have the ear of people in power." And by this time, Herzel had given up on it. Nobody was going to listen to him. But Heckler had been the tutor for the son of the Duke of Baden-Baden, who was the nephew of the Kaiser. And he also had an inroad with the Sultan in Constantinople. And he had a number of other significant political connections. And so he went to Herzel and said, I can get you in front of these people, and we can make this happen. And that was in 1896, and in 1897 you have the first Zionist convention. And so the point that I'm making here is that Herzel was significant on the Jewish side, but he didn't have any traction until a Christian came along. And I began to think about that and realized that if you go back to the 1640s, what we discover is that you have this same pattern throughout the history of Zionism. You have, on the one hand, you have the Christians who are thinking one way, and they are beginning to realize that there needs to be a place for the Jewish people, and they need to be restored to their historic homeland. And on the other hand, you have a gradual realization taking place in the Jewish community that doesn't really get much traction until you get to about 1840. But there's a gradual realization that they don't have to wait for the Messiah to come to go back to their historic homeland. And so I just want to tell some things about that story. So here's Herzel, whose dates were 1860 to 1904. He basically gave his life for Zionism. And it was the Dreyfus affair that triggered that. So what is Zionism? In Walter LaCour's book on the history of Zionism, he said, Zionism, according to a recent encyclopedia, is a worldwide political movement launched by Theodor Herzl in 1897. The Jewish national revival, which took place in the 19th century, culminated in political Zionism, was preceded by a great many activities and publications, by countless projects, declarations, and meetings. The term Zionism was first used publicly by Nathan Birnbaum at a discussion meeting in Vienna on the evening of 23 January 1892. So the history of political Zionism begins with the publication of Der Judenstaat 4 years later and the first Zionist Congress. But these Zionist ideas predate or antedate the name and the organization. So here's a picture of William Heckler when he was younger and when he was older. Now what's interesting about his background is he was reared, his parents were British citizens, they lived in India for a while, but they were Plymouth Brethren background. And a pattern that you will see in the late 19th century to early 20th century is the number of Christians who are brought up on the Bible at their mother's knee. They're hearing the Bible stories, and they develop a realization. Of course, they think of Israel and they think of the Jews in biblical terms, but it sets a framework to where they recognize that we are to honor the Jewish people. And that is fundamental, and we'll see that thread running through this discussion. Richard Popkin, who is a historian of ideas, wrote, "Much of Zionism has its roots in Christian rather than Jewish doctrine." Now, I have given this talk at a Jewish synagogue in Dallas, and what's interesting is that none of them were familiar with a lot of the things, any of the things that I was saying on the Christian side. And I say that because during the Mike's session, I was back talking over some things with Mitch Glazer, and I was going through this. Mitch knew most of this. I said, but you're a historian and I'm a historian. But most people aren't historians. And because he was thinking, he said, well, I thought most people knew that about Heckler and Herzel. I said, no, they don't. They're lucky if they know one or the other, depending on their tradition. I would bet that unless you've been listening to me for a while and you've heard me teach on this, you probably never heard the name William Heckler before. Or unless you've gone to Israel, because about 6 years ago, they opened a new museum there called, what's it called? I had COVID, so the day we went there, I didn't get to go, so I can't remember the name. What's the name of it, Randy? Friends of Zion, that's right. And it's great, and they have a lot of tremendous little displays of the different things that have happened among Christians. So for Jews to go there and see that, they began to get a realization of how Christians have helped. So first of all, we need to define a few terms. So what exactly is Zionism? According to the Jewish Virtual Library, its general definition means the national movement for the return of the Jewish people to their homeland and the resumption of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. A basic definition that Dr. Ice would have given is it's just simply the desire of the Jewish people to establish their own nation in their historic homeland. Now that phrase is really important. We'll come to it when we get to the Balfur Declaration, that phrase, their historic homeland, because that's recognizing that there is a historic claim that goes back to God's promise to Abraham to give this particular piece of real estate to the Jewish people. So if that's Zionism, what in the world then is Christian Zionism? And this was a term that really wasn't used until into the, I think, 1930s or 1940s. Christian Zionism then refers to Christians who desire the Jewish people to have the land of Israel as their national homeland. There's an older term, and that is the term Restorationism, which we'll talk about at first, or British Restorationism. But first we have to go back. I want to pick up a couple of things that Dr. Stallard mentioned on his first session on Monday when he was talking about what does Israel mean in the Bible, and the issue of history and the history of what happens to terminology. So here's our timeline. From 33, with the death of Christ on the cross, 50 days later, the birth of the church on the day of Pentecost, up to, and when I first made this chart, it was 2016, but it obviously goes to today. So we divide this. I teach church history for Chafer Seminary, so this is a basic division for the eras of church history. You have the early and medieval church, and then today we're in the period of the modern church. What divides them is the Protestant Reformation, which began October 31st of 1517. So from 33 until 600, you have just the early church. It is the Catholic Church, lowercase c, which simply means the universal church. There's no divisions, and there's no official central hierarchy, and there's the doctrines of soteriology, the doctrines related to Mary and the Pope and transubstantiation and the Mass are not there. You know, this is just the early church. And so, but in 600, you have Gregory the Great becomes the Pope and ascends to the papacy. And that's where people will mark, usually there or a little bit later, the beginning of the Roman Catholic Church. And then when you get to the Protestant Reformation, then you have the multiplication of different Protestant denominations. But from 150, that early church period, from 33 to 150 to 200, somewhere in there, you're characterized mostly by a literal interpretation. There's some allegorical interpretation in there. It's not necessarily systematized, but Israel means Israel. And the church means the church. Israel, to quote Dr. Stallard, Israel doesn't mean C-H-U-R-C-H. And church does not mean I-S-R-A-E-L. So it's a literal interpretation. Israel's ethnic Israel, the church equals the church, and they hold to a future return of the Jewish people to their historic homeland. And these ideas are central to the foundations of dispensationalism. So we can see that even though it's not systematized, dispensationalism believes in a literal historical interpretation, as Dr. Ryrie stated. The second is a distinction between Israel and the church. And the third is that ultimately all of history and all of the Bible is designed to reflect the glory of God. So we see the two primary characteristics of dispensationalism already present in the teaching there in the early church. But after Origen, who is an early church father who introduced a tremendous amount of error into the church on the foundation of his introduction of allegorical interpretation. For Origen, every passage has three levels of meaning on the analogy of body, soul, and spirit. So you have the literal meaning, then you have a soulish meaning, which may have some loose connection to the literal meaning, but the spiritual meaning, which is really the fundamental issue, has no connection whatsoever to the actual literal meaning of the text. And so you're always spiritualizing, allegoricalizing, and you are using a lot of mysticism in your interpretation, what I call liver quiver. So you get now to a point where Israel is the church in the Old Testament and the church is spiritual Israel, and these terms are very much confused, and it leads to what we now refer to as replacement theology, where Israel is permanently replaced by the church because they are the Christ killers. And because they rejected Jesus as the Messiah, God is permanently rejecting them, and all of the promises will be fulfilled and be given to the church. And this eventually lays the foundation. It doesn't necessarily produce anti-Semitism, but it is the seedbed out of which Christian anti-Semitism will flourish, will sprout and flourish in the Middle Ages. Then with the Protestant Reformation, there is a return to literal interpretation. It's gradual. At the beginning, you have Martin Luther, who nails his 95 Theses on the door of the church in Wittenberg on October 31st, 1517. And then he is followed by others, by Zwingli in German Swiss areas, by Calvin in the French Swiss areas, many other reformers. And gradually, as you move through the 1630s, 1640s, 1650s, they move from just a literal interpretation applied to salvation passages and justification passages and dealing with soteriology, but they began to apply this to other areas of theology, so that by the time you get to the early 1600s, they're beginning to apply it to future events. And so through most of the 1500s, they're still amillennial. Calvin and Luther have no idea of distinguishing between Israel and the church in any way. Their teaching on those subjects is the same as in the Roman Catholic Church. But you start to have a few people come along and they start to interpret the scriptures literally. And once they do that, they begin to see that they begin to turn to be premillennialists, and the kingdom is future, and the kingdom is for Israel. So therefore that means that the Jewish people must have a future in their historic homeland, and there will be a literal physical return of the Jewish people to their historic homeland. This became known as British Restorationism. And so with that development, basically defining the term, With the return to a literal interpretation of the Bible, English Puritans began to shift to premillennialism and realized God must restore the Jewish people to their historic homeland before the establishment of the millennial kingdom. What's interesting is there's a recent book out that maybe one of our students or one of our faculty would like to write a book review on, called The Decline and Fall of Dispensationalism. And this guy was interviewed by Al Mohler, and there's a YouTube video of that up on the internet. But it's the same old tried and false accusations against dispensationalists. And someone called me and was having a panic attack and said, "Robbie, you have to answer this. You have to do this. There has to be an answer." And my reply was, well, it seems to me that somewhere around 1991, there was a group of people, myself included, who formed an organization called the Pre-Trib Rapture Study Group. Dr. Price, have you heard about that? Randy and I are both on the board for Pre-Trib. And so what has happened over the years is they have published a number of the papers all the papers that have been presented at the conference, and there's a lot of those are video presentations, and there have even been books like Dr. Bill Watson, who went to be with the Lord a few years ago, but he wrote a book called Dispensationalism Before Darby. But if you listen to this guy interviewed by Mohler, there's no dispensationalism before Darby. In other words, they're ignoring, my reply was, no, every argument in that book has been answered and in detail by the various papers that are on the Pre-Trib website. And often people can make what appear to be simplified accusations. Well, there was no dispensationalism before Darby, but you can't answer that in 3 sentences. But they've ignored it all. And what you see is that historically you go back into this period of the Puritans in the 17th century, and Bill Watson, he was a real nevishy little guy who loved to take his vacations, and he would go and spend them in the dusty old libraries at Cambridge and Oxford and many other lesser known universities in England, and dust off the volumes of the Puritan sermons. Sometimes he had to teach himself German so that he could read some of these things, and he discovered that there were all of the main dispensational ideas were there, and there were many who were even pre-tribulational because they did not believe that the church would go through the time of Jacob's trouble. But that's ignored, totally. You know, there's an article Tommy wrote for BibSac on Pseudo-Ephraim. And that was published and came out, I think, in the early 2000s or late 1990s, and that was ignored. But I'm simply pointing out that this is a significant movement that took place among the Puritans in the 19th century. So how did it get there? England was originally pro-Jewish. William the Conqueror encouraged Jewish merchants and artisans in North France to move to England after the Battle of Hastings. Jews came from there, from Germany, Italy, and Spain to escape the anti-Semitism in those countries. Jewish communities were established in London, in York, in Bristol, Canterbury, and Norwich as well, and other key cities, and they lived in segregated areas. Jews were the bankers and the money lenders, since usury was prohibited by the Roman Catholic Church. However, the king had to have his share. He taxed the Jewish bankers somewhat heavily. But then England became anti-Semitic. Persecutions developed. The first blood libel charge. You know what the blood libel is? Blood libel is the accusation that they are using the blood of a Christian child in order to make the matzah for Passover. And so you see forms of that now again and again, but we'll talk about the blood libel accusation again a little bit later. The first time that appears in history is in 1144 in Norwich, England, and that inspired several Jewish riots. The Third Crusade, which came along not long after that, also brought increased anti-Semitism to England. And then following the death of Henry II, who protected the Jews, a riot in York led to the massacre of the Jews there. Richard I found out about this a day later and ordered the Jews protected. Then when he left for the Crusades, the riots broke out again. Anti-Semitism increased in England until finally on the 9th of Av. Who knows what the 9th of Av is? Yes, I knew you would, Paul. The 9th of Av is the date of the anniversary of the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. Jews also believe that's the date that the First Temple was destroyed, and that numerous other catastrophes have happened to the Jewish people on that date. It's roughly the end of July, first week or so of August. And so Edward I expelled the Jews, and 16,000 Jews left England. So there's no Jews in England from 1290 until when? Now we're going to find out. But it's important to understand that for what happens. Okay, so we have the rise of the British Restorationism. Barbara Tuchman, in her book, The Bible and the Sword, which I would encourage you to read if you haven't, which is an excellent source for this, says that starting with the Puritan ascendancy, the movement among the English for the return of the Jews to Palestine began. So there were a variety of motivations for Christian support for a restitution of the Jews to their historic homeland. First of all, there's a missionary desire to provide for the conversion of Jews, which they understood from the Bible to occur at or near the time of the future establishment of the Messianic kingdom. So they recognized there's going to be a turning of the Jewish community to Christ, so that spurred Jewish evangelism. Second, there was a humanitarian desire to provide a safe haven for the Jewish people. Third, a desire to help with the fulfillment of prophecy. And that's not real high on the list. Today, I don't see that. But it not only, as far as I can tell, that idea derived more from a Jewish rabbi than it did from Christians. First time I took a group to Israel, I was astonished to discover that there is a belief in the Jewish community, and I've never heard, I don't know if any of you have, but I've never heard any kind of Christian say that the reason that we want the Jews to go back to their homeland is so that they'll all be there, so when the Messiah comes back, he'll kill them all. But that is what is said in the Jewish community. But I've never heard any Christian ever say that. Another motivation is just a sincere love for the Jewish people. And fifth, a nationalistic desire to see people in their historic homeland. That would apply to the 19th century. You have all kinds of people, the Germans, the Italians, others in the Balkan areas who are coming together and want to have their own country for their ethnic people. And so the desire of the Jewish people to go to their national homeland was just a natural outgrowth of that nationalistic desire. So the Reformation gave us an emphasis on the Bible, sola scriptura. As it developed in the Puritan community, there's a resurrection of the study of a Hebrew language. They were going to rabbis to have them teach them Hebrew so they could read the Hebrew text. You have the development of the translation of the Bible into English, beginning in the early part of the 16th century with Tyndale. You have identification in the Puritan community with Old Testament heroes, struggles, and stories, and they would give Hebrew names to their kids. They loved to do that. They were in love with the Old Testament. In hermeneutics, there's a return to a literal hermeneutic, which meant a literal kingdom, a literal future for a restored Jewish nation. And the English Puritans saw the biblical prophecy of a return of the Jews to their historic homeland. Now, in reference to what's happening in the Christian community, Lucian Wolff, who wrote a short book on Manasseh ben Israel, who's a prominent rabbi in Holland at the time, And in his foreword to set the historic stage, he says the Reformation in England first turned Jewish eyes towards the land. So who was it that turned the Jews' eyes towards their historic homeland? Christians. It was the Reformation that caused the Jews to first turn their eyes to the historic homeland. And then there's this man, Sir Henry Finch. We've heard of William Blackstone's commentaries on English law. Well, before Blackstone, there was Sir Henry Finch. Sir Henry Finch lived in the early part of the 1600s, 1558 to 1625. At one time, he is the Chancellor of the Exchequer. And he was a key proponent for Israel's future restoration. He wrote a seminal work on the subject in 1621. What happens around 1621? Pilgrims come here in 1620. Called the World's Resurrection, or the Calling of the Jews, a present to Judah and the children of Israel that joined with him, and to Joseph, that valiant tribe of Ephraim, and all the house of Israel that joined with him. That's the title. Okay. We have shorter titles today. So at this time, he was a member of Parliament and the most highly respected legal scholar in England at the time. There were passages which speak of a return of these people to their own land, he said, their conquest of enemies, their rule to the nations, and they are to be taken literally, not allegorically, as of the church. He said, where Israel, Judah, Zion, Jerusalem, etc. are named in this argument, the Holy Ghost meaneth not the spiritual Israel, or church of God collected of the Gentiles, no, nor of the Jews and Gentiles both, for each of these have their promises severally and apart, but Israel properly descended out of Jacob's loins. Because he taught that there would be a return of the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and all of the nations would bow down to him, James I did not like this. So he threw him in prison, and he died a pauper. Wolfe says, again, he says, it was the increasing Hebraism of English thought as represented by the Puritan movement, which chiefly attracted the Jews. When the Commonwealth, with its pronounced Judaical tendencies, the Commonwealth is the Cromwell Protectorate, with its pronounced Judaical tendencies emerged from the movement, the Jews could not fail but to be impressed. So what happens in this period is in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and Ferdinand and Isabella cast all of the Jews out of Spain on the threat of death. And some say that there were many of them that went on the boats with Columbus and with subsequent explorers. And in fact, there's an interesting book called The Jewish Pirates of the Caribbean. Because, as the author has documented, many of these pirates had roots as Jews in Spain. And they even set up, Jamaica was the headquarters for the Spanish Empire, but the Gentiles couldn't administer all of the money. So Charles V, the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, said they had a code. They referred to Jews as Portuguese. And so the administrator in the colony said, we need about 40 Portuguese to come here and straighten everything out. And so he sent 40 Portuguese families to Jamaica and turned the colony around and made it quite financially successful. So, see, those are the things you were never taught in school. There were conflicts over religious liberty, increasing publications of restorationist ideas, along with calls to readmit the Jews to England. In January 5th, 1649, a Christian family, the mom is Johanna, the son is Ebenezer Cartwright, and they petitioned Parliament to readmit the Jews to England. On January 6th, the High Court of Justice authorized the trial of Charles I on treason, and so their petition was shelved and forgotten. So here is the petition of the Jews for the repealing of the Act of Parliament for their banishment out of England. And in that they said, in this nation of England, where the inhabitants of the Netherlands shall be the first and readiest to transport Israel's sons and daughters in their ships to the land promised to their forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for an everlasting inheritance. They're ready to start moving them there and bring in the kingdom, because they were also influenced by this guy a little bit. The Rabbi Manasseh ben Israel. In 1650, he published Hope of Israel, in which he advocated the return of Jews to England as preliminary to the appearance of the Messiah. He had some unusual views. He believed the 10 lost tribes were in America, so we need to send more explorers to South America and North America. He believed that Messiah would not come until the Jews were regathered. Does that remind you of something? You know, this idea among the Jews that Christians want the Jews to get back in the land so that when the Messiah comes, they'll be there and be slaughtered. Well, he's talking about the Messiah. We have to get all the Jews back into the land for the Messiah to come. That originated as a Jewish idea. They just distort it today. Third, the regathering would only come after a complete scattering. Manasseh ben Israel said they have to be in every country. So he goes to Cromwell and gets an audience, and he says, there aren't any Jews in England. The Messiah cannot come until Jews have been scattered into all the countries. So you need to change things up and let the Jews come back so we can help facilitate the return of the Messiah. So England is then, Cromwell changes the policy. It's not official, but he just basically puts the word out, let the Jews in, and they started pouring back in. So this was his booklet, The Hope of Israel, in 1655. So you have on the one hand these two Christians, and they petition Parliament to let the Jews in, and on the other hand you have the Jewish rabbi who comes along, and the result of that is that they allow the Jews to come back into the land. He said, for I conceived that our universal dispersion was a necessary circumstance to be fulfilled before all that shall be accomplished which the Lord hath promised to the people of the Jews concerning their restoration. And he goes to Daniel 12:7 to support that. He also said that Cromwell was or Lucian Wolff writes that Cromwell thought it was his own scheme, but he's influenced by these other two. Now we're going to jump over the pond and come to America. You have the Mather clan, and we're going to talk about Increase Mather. He's the son of Richard and the father of Cotton. They were a brilliant family up in Massachusetts, and many of the Puritans that came to America were premillennial. And he wrote, his first book was The Mystery of Israel's Salvation. He wrote over 125 books. He didn't have a computer or a word processor. He had probably a quill pen. Pens, yes. And there were many, they were big books. It's just amazing the time to write that. But he didn't have TV, and he didn't have an iPhone. He didn't have any distractions. So he wrote in his first book, his support of the national restoration of Israel to her land in the future was typical of American colonial Puritans, as was generally widespread. This was written about him. You'll also see it in the seals of the early American Ivy League schools. You see that they have Hebrew lettering in their seals. Here you have Urim and Thummim, and this is the seal of Yale, and the seal of Columbia has Yahweh at the top center there. You also have a reference to 1 Peter 2:1 and 2 down at the very bottom. Then you have Dartmouth here, and it has El Shaddai in the triangle up above. So that just reflects they're enamored with Hebraism. So we'll kind of move through the 1700s, and what happens at the end of the 1700s is that Napoleon has his campaigns in the Middle East. And what happens here is there's an increased presence of the French and the British in the Middle East. So when we come to 100 years later, and we're talking about the British mandate over Palestine, over Israel, and we talk about the French getting a mandate over Syria and Lebanon, it starts here, because it's at this time that they start moving into the Middle East. In Paris, Napoleon reconvened the Sanhedrin in 1807, and then he is going to swing down through the Middle East, through Egypt, and come up through Palestine. And this just triggers a lot of speculation about the end times, and they begin to go back to Scripture to think about what's going to happen. You have a little bit of a development of some of the dispensational ideas on the distinction between Israel and the church at the same time, but they were looking at the restoration of the Jews to their land. But on the Jewish side, restoration was associated with the coming of the Messiah. You have one Jew, David Levy, who wrote a 3-volume dissertations on the prophecies of the Old Testament, where he begins to suggest that they don't have to wait for the Messiah in order to return to the land. In 1809, Solomon Bennett, in Constancy of Israel, says Messiah is just not that important for the Jewish people. And then in 1818, Mordecai Manuel Noah, he's an American, writes Discourse at the Congregation Sharit in 1818, arguing for the same thing. About this time, the president is John Adams. John Adams said, I really wish the Jews, again in Judea, an independent nation, for as I believe the most enlightened men of it have participated in the amelioration of the philosophy of the age. On the Christian side again, Reverend James Bischino, whose dates are 1751 to 1831, is an Anabaptist pastor in Newberry, publishes a book called The Signs of the Times, in which he says that just in the underlined portion, though, this does not demand any conversion of Jews prior to their restoration. Took that from Nahum Sokolov's 2 volumes on the history of Zionism. Again, on the Christian side, you begin to see the development of British restorationism into a more activist role. In 1809, there is the founding by Joseph Fry, who is a Messianic Jew, of the establishment, and also William Wilberforce, and several others, Lord Palmerston, Lord Shaftesbury, others are part of this development that takes place here of the Society for the Promotion of Christianity among the Jews. And one thing that's significant about this, the title is often just shortened to the British or the London Jews Society. Joseph Wolff, who is also a Jew who has come to recognition of Yeshua's Messiah, converted in 1812. He moved to Jerusalem, and that led to the idea of establishing a mission in Jerusalem. This was very, very important. So this London Jews Society then is going to eventually buy some land and establish a mission there. We'll get to that in a second. Now, on the political side, in 1819, there's increased persecution in Germany. Mordecai Noah, who's American, calls for the Jews to leave Germany and immigrate to Palestine. In the 1820s, there's increased anti-Semitism under Alexander I. I remember hearing people say, well, you know, all of this is just Christians trying to fulfill prophecy or Jews trying to fulfill prophecy. You don't understand the historical dynamics if you think about that. You have leaders of various different countries who are pushing the Jews to go back. And on the one hand, they're doing it positively. On the other hand, they're doing it through the pogroms and persecution in Russia. There's no hidden hand of conspiracy working on all of this. The only hidden hand is the providential hand of God. So there's this increased persecution in Germany, increased persecution under Alexander I and Nicholas I in Russia, and they continue to draft young Jewish boys, forcing conversions along the way, which causes Jewish families to want to leave. Then, in the Ottoman Empire, you have Muhammad Ali. Just like to see who is still awake. 1831, he rebels against the Ottoman Empire. 1832, he took control of Jerusalem and Accra and Damascus and Aleppo. 1833, he permitted European missionaries into the Holy Land, and in 1839, the British established a consulate in Jerusalem, and Egypt defeated the Ottoman Empire. So the boundaries of the Ottoman Empire, which used to go all the way down to North Africa, are now pushed back up into the area of Palestine. But there's no country here. This is just a loose term that is used to describe the region. On another side, you have British politicians who were coming along, like Viscount Henry John Temple, Viscount Palmerston, and Anthony Ashley Cooper, the 7th Earl of Shaftesbury. So Shaftesbury's, Palmerston is related to Shaftesbury via marriage, and Shaftesbury and Palmerston are both very instrumental. They're both evangelical believers, and they're very instrumental in the founding of the London Jew Society, and they're active in developing a lot of works in helping the Jews get back to their historic homeland. Palmerston says there exists at the present time among the Jews dispersed over Europe a strong notion that the time is approaching when their nation is to return to Palestine. It would be of manifest importance to the Sultan to encourage the Jews to return and to settle in Palestine, because the wealth which they would bring with them would increase the resources of the Sultan's dominions. And the Jewish people, if returning under the sanction and protection and at the invitation of the Sultan, would be a check upon any future evil designs of Muhammad Ali or his successor. I have to instruct Your Excellency strongly to recommend to the Turkish government to hold out every just encouragement to the Jews of Europe to return to Palestine. That was written to the ambassador at Constantinople. On the Christian side, the London Society of the Jews missionary John Nicolason goes to Jerusalem and purchases 2 plots of land, which will eventually become the location of Christ Church. If you've been to Israel and you go through the Jaffa Gate and you go down and the road or the street begins to make a turn to the right, you've got the Tower of David on your right, and then you will have Christ Church on the left. And they have the church there now, services. They have a small museum, and the docent in the museum there is also a product of Word of God Bible College in Kiev, and she and I were both together the morning that the war started. I was up in my apartment, but the first thing I did was text down to the school where she was staying, "Are you okay? What's going on down there?" And then I moved my bags down there, and then we went to the store and bought groceries. She had been living in Israel as a docent at Christ Church until COVID, but she had more freedom in Kiev than in Jerusalem, so she went back to Kiev, and now she's back in Jerusalem. Her name's Nina. And so Nina works there at Christ Church. At the same time, you have among the Jewish people Sir Moses Montefiore, who's a wealthy financier, and he is hoping to induce the return of thousands of our brethren to the land of Israel. He wrote that in 1839 on May 24th. And also working with him later on was an American Christian named Gawler, who provided an agricultural strategy for Jewish resettlement of the land. And so the Montefiore Gawler team, you have a Jew and a Christian, started the planting of orange groves down near Jaffa. And I know up until, I mean, even when I was a kid, I remember hearing about Jaffa oranges. And so that would help provide a means of resource in agriculture. In the late 1830s, Rabbi Judah Alkali, who was up in the Bucharest area, wrote a book called Darhai Noam, Pleasant Paths, and called upon his fellow Jews to prepare for the redemption by prayer and spiritual devotion to Zion. He interprets teshuvah, repentance, as a return to the land, and said that Jews did not have to wait for Messiah in order to return to the land. Now we go into the 1840s. Politically, what happens in February is there is the blood libel in Damascus where a child went missing, and they accused the Jews of having kidnapped him to use his blood to make matzah for Passover. Christian, at the same time, you have the first construction of the future Christ Church in Jerusalem. Among the Jews, the rabbis asked the London Jew Society missionary Nicolaisen to help defend the Jews in the Damascus libel. And Montefiore went to Damascus, and there were also a revolt by Druze and Christians against Muhammad Ali. And then the King of Prussia, William IV, sought to establish with the Anglicans and with Lutherans a joint Protestant bishopric in Jerusalem. This would be the first Protestant bishop, or first bishop since the days of the apostle. Politically, England, Russia, Austria, and Prussia issue an ultimatum to Muhammad Ali to withdraw from Syria and Palestine. The British went in and captured Acre and Jaffa, which led to a British fortification at Acre in support of the Ottomans. So you see the increasing presence of the British in Palestine. The possession of Acre would open a road for the return of biblical truth to the land from which that truth had spread to the human race, and the Englishmen would feel guilty of sin if they failed to impress upon their government the need of seizing this glorious and blessed opportunity. 1841, a Jewish believer in Yeshua named Michael Solomon, who had been ordained in the Anglican Church, was appointed the new Protestant Bishop of Jerusalem. And he is there for a couple of years. Unfortunately, he died early. Then the British consul in Damascus, a distant relative of Winston Churchill's, Sir Henry Churchill, defended the Jews against the blood libel charge. And then he proposed a strategy for creating a Jewish state 50 years before Herzel. He wrote, "I cannot conceal from you my most anxious desire to see your countrymen endeavor once more to resume their existence as a people." So the 1840s, you see a huge movement taking place. You have the purchase of land, which then is Christ Church is built on. You have missionaries to the Jews moving to Jerusalem. What you also see is because of the increased persecutions in Russia and the Slavic countries, the Jews are leaving there, moving down into Palestine. They are cobblers and they are shopkeepers. They are not farmers. And so they're starving to death, but the Christians come along and teach them to farm and feed them. And so again, you see this connection between the Christians and the Jews. Politically, Tsar Alexander II in the 1880s is going to reverse the anti-Semitic policies of his father. This ushers in an era called the Haskalah. The Haskalah is the term for the Jewish Enlightenment. And so then you develop this ideal of the assimilated and secular Jew in Russia. And the Jewish population then increases from 2.3 million in 1850 to 5 million, 4% of the Russian population, which scares them. So Tsar Alexander is assassinated in 1881. It's blamed on the Jews. It was not. And this ushered in a new era of pogroms. Pogrom is a Russian word. Tsar Alexander III is a virulent anti-Semite. 1882, he establishes the anti-Jewish decrees called the May Laws. He closed rural areas to Jewish settlement, forcing them into urban ghettos. He removed Jews from the professions, and the government hope was to cause a third of the Jewish population to die off. This disillusioned many of the Jewish Haskalah leaders, who abandoned hope of assimilation and began to focus on aliyah. Aliyah is the Hebrew word for immigration, going to Israel. They wrote, "Let us go now to the only land in which we will find relief for our souls that have been harassed by murderers for these thousands of years. Our beginnings will be small, but in the end we will furnish." This was Moshe Lillenblum, Jewish humanist and leading Haskalah writers. At the same time that William Heckler, going back to the introduction, William Heckler comes along. His father is a missionary, Plymouth Brethren background, missionary with the London Jew Society. And so he is reared in a British restorationist home. He's given a passion for Israel. He has a lifelong desire to bring the Jewish people to Christ. In 1873, he's the tutor to Grand Duke Frederick of Baden, son of Frederick I, uncle of Kaiser Wilhelm, and in the 1880s, the first British clergy to visit persecuted Jews in Mogilov, Odessa, and Kishinev. He wrote in 1883, The Restoration of the Jews According to the Prophets. In that he says the duty of every Christian is to pray earnestly and to long for the restoration of God's chosen race and to love the Jews, for they are still beloved for their Father's sake. In 1885, he's appointed chaplain of the British Embassy in Vienna. Again, on the Christian side, you have William E. Blackstone, who is a dispensationalist. He wrote a little book called Jesus is Coming. And he says, "Why shall not the powers which under the Treaty of Berlin in 1878 gave Bulgaria to the Bulgarians and Serbia to the Serbians now give Palestine back to the Jews? These provinces, as well as Romania, Montenegro, and Greece, were wrested from the Turks and given to their natural owners. Does not Israel as rightfully belong to the Jews?" So he puts forth something that is called a Blackstone petition, and that is set forth, and it's signed by 413 prominent Christians and a few Jewish leaders. And so his focus is on encouraging, and part of the Blackstone document is to encourage the restoration of the Jewish people to their land. So in November 24th and 25th, 1890, he organized the conference on the past, present, and future of Israel. Does that sound familiar? At the First Methodist Episcopal Church in Chicago, where participants included leaders of both Jewish and Christian communities. So he says, why not give Palestine back to them again? According to God's distribution of nations, it's their home, an inalienable possession from which they were expelled by force. And so most members of Congress signed it, the president signed it, many of the chief justices signed it, many of the top people in business, from Rockefeller to Carnegie, all signed it, and they were all in favor of promoting a Jewish restoration to their historic homeland. So this petition was called the Blackstone Memorial, and some years later, in 1918, Nathan Strauss, who was a secretary to Louis Brandeis, who's a president of the Zionist Organization of America in 1916, he later is promoted to the Supreme Court, appointed to the Supreme Court by FDR. And he's considered the foremost Zionist in America in 1916. And on his behalf, Nathan Strauss wrote to Blackstone, Mr. Brandeis agrees with me that you are the father of Zionism as your work antedates Herzel. I've taught this to 2 or 3 Jewish groups, and they're stunned with that statement because they're not taught anything about the role of Christian Zionists. And so this kind of information is really, really helpful for us to have. Of course, during this time, you have the Dreyfus trial where this French Jewish officer who's totally assimilated, thinks of himself as only French, is accused of spying for the Russians. And it reveals the ugliness and the depth of anti-Semitism in France. And this is where we started earlier. And so this leads Herzel to write Der Judenstaat, and because he realizes Jews could never assimilate. And he says, we are a people, one people. We have sincerely tried everywhere to merge with the national communities in which we live, seeking only to preserve the faith of our fathers. It has not been permitted us. So the assimilation and wealthy elite of, I got to look and see how much more time I have. I could go on forever. I've got a break in about 4 minutes. Okay. So it leads to the Zionist conventions, and it happens because of a Christian that we've already talked about, William Heckler. Here is Heckler's tombstone in England, where it says, when the Lord shall build up Zion, he shall appear in his glory, Psalm 102:16. And underneath his name, a lover of God, his word, and his ancient people, tireless adversary of anti-Semitism, friend and counselor of Theodor Herzel. So this is the role of the Christian. So we have these things taking place. On the one hand, Christians, on the other hand, Jews. So this is the Ottoman Empire in 1900. Would somebody point out where the state of Palestine is located? There never was one. This is just area, and there are, Randy had some quotes the first night on this from Mark Twain and 2 or 3 others who wrote. One was a French cartographer in the late 1600s, wrote that he went to the land of Palestine to map out every location he could find from the Bible. He located over 2,000 towns and villages, and he was also a linguist, and he wrote that he could not find a single village or town or location that had an Arab name. Now, some of the places had an ancient Greek name or Jewish name that had been written in Arabic, like the ancient temples of Pan up near Caesarea Philippi, and now it's called Banyas, because Arabs can't pronounce the letter P, so there's really no such thing as a Palestinian. So the last thing I want to briefly touch on is the Balfur Declaration. This was the primary motivation, was the religious beliefs of the War Cabinet about the Jewish people. And so this is in the height of World War I in 1916, and they make a decision to support the Jewish people and their desire for a national homeland. This is the letter that is written. It's not an official, it can't be an official policy statement. It's more of an expression at that time of a wish and desire on the part of the British government. And Balfur writes, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, he's writing to the head of the Jewish organization in England, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. That was not the original reading. Now, this is very important. That was not the original writing. They had to massage it some in the committee on the British War Committee. The original reading was the historic home for the Jewish people. So they changed that. Why is that important? Well, I'm going to tell you in a minute. Don't fall asleep. They'll use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Notice that. Nothing may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, who's this war cabinet? Lloyd George was Welsh, he was Baptist, he was reared in the home of a pastor. Arthur Balfur is a Scots Presbyterian. Arthur Henderson is a Scottish Methodist lay preacher. George Barnes is a Scot. Andrew Barnard Law, who from the age of 12 had lived in Scotland in the Free Church of Scotland. Edward Montague was Jewish. He voted against the Balfour Declaration because he thought it would increase anti-Semitism. Edward Carson was an Irish Presbyterian. Jan Christian Smuts was a Dutch Calvinist from South Africa. Alfred Milner was German-born, and Lord Curzon was Anglican. He was the other one who voted against it. But they voted in favor of it. It had no force in international law. On April 20th, 1920, the Supreme Council of the Principal Allied Powers in the San Remo resolutions incorporated verbatim the words of the Balfour Declaration, making it a legal document. San Remo gave the Balfour Declaration the force of international law. Third, all of the borders drawn up to form the nations which came out of the Ottoman Empire have their legal basis in San Remo. So if you come along and say, well, they had no authority to lay out these boundaries and create these nations, that applies to Iraq. The borders of Iran, between Iraq and Iran, that border is established at San Remo. The border between Turkey and Syria is established. The border south between Israel and Saudi Arabia is established by that. So all of these borders, the borders of Lebanon, all those borders were established at San Remo. So you can't throw out one without throwing out all of them, is my point. The San Remo resolution set forth the international legal authority called a mandate from the League of Nations to designate European nations who would administer these territories until the indigenous people would govern themselves. And Randy's got some maps on that and what happened, so I'm not going to say anything more about that. Fifth, the Balfour Declaration was incorporated verbatim in the preface to the British Mandate document. What's important is the guy who wrote the preface was Arthur Balfour. Arthur Balfour wrote the preface with the original wording of the Balfour Declaration, which said to restore them to their historic homeland. That then was voted on and approved by 55 nations at the League of Nations, making it international law. And it has never been rescinded. When the UN started, the UN Charter said they had to enforce all treaties that had been previously enacted by the League of Nations. And then because of the intensity of the Arab revolt, the realization of the Holocaust, and wanting to have a place of refuge for Jews, the Jewish leadership under Chaim Weizmann in the late 30s absolutely ignored all of international law, said, we're not going to fight for that. Just give us whatever we get, no matter how small, we'll be happy. Now, the epilogue is Charles Ord Wingate. He was a British officer who taught them how to do guerrilla warfare. He is one of the heroes in special forces operations, and he was quite a character. He taught them how to night fight. He trained Moshe Dayan, as well as many others. And he said of his love for the Jewish people about his mother, she taught me that I must live by the Bible and that I must help the prophecies of the Bible to come true. It was she who told me to befriend the Jews and help them to fulfill the biblical prophecy and return to Palestine. He died when a U.S. bomber he was riding in was shot down by the Japanese over Burma. After the war, they couldn't distinguish the bodies, so they were all buried at Arlington National Cemetery in a group grave. And this is the headstone, and it says right here, Ord Charles Wingate, Major General, DSO, British Army. Any questions? Clay, you've got one question over here. I ran 5 minutes over our time, so oh, that one, yeah.
Okay, quick comment and quick question. I had a friend, 80s and 90s, we were best friends, we worked together, she was Jewish. She moved away, she moved to Colorado, and 10 years after that I went to her daughter's bat mitzvah. And, and we were always bantering back and forth about Jesus and he's your Messiah and that kind of thing. Not seriously, because she was my friend. But when I went to the bat mitzvah, I had been to Israel, and I said, Israel is fabulous. Guys, you guys could go there. You could live there. And she said, well, that's what you Jews want. Y'all want all the Jews. I mean, that's what you Christians want. You want all the Jews to go back to Israel so you can kill them all at once, and then Jesus will come back.
Yep.
That's what she said.
Oh, I know.
I've never heard that before.
Yeah.
And my question is the Dreyfus incident. I've heard about it for years, but it always says, well, he was exonerated. How was he exonerated?
He was pardoned by the ruler of France. And what happened was they discovered that he'd been framed, and they were able to document it. But he still spent 12 years in French prison on one of the prison islands. So there's a real miscarriage of justice. Rick, you'll get the, I'll let you comment in just a minute. Let Rick, what?
Did you tell I was going to get the last one?
Yeah.
Okay, when Judah was taken over by Babylon, all the Jewish people were taken off to Babylon, and God commanded them to assimilate into Babylonian culture, which I'm assuming was successful. In one of your slides, one of the Jewish leaders said, we cannot assimilate into the nations. What changed?
What happened? First of all, they did not assimilate in Babylon, because when Babylon is defeated by the Persians, and then when Esther comes along and Mordecai and Haman, they're not assimilated. They're living there, but they're not assimilated. Okay, so they didn't lose their identity. And people talk about the 10 lost tribes, but when you read the text, you realize that who was that? Was that Sennacherib? Is coming down from when the Assyrians are coming down from the north, the believers in the north are headed south. They're going into Judah. So all of the 10 tribes are down in the south. Not all of the 10 tribes, but all of the 10 tribes are represented down in the south. All right, well, we need to take a break now, and we come back. I believe it is, what time? 3:10 for Charlie Bing, Israel's Iron Dome of Grace.